I'm Otto Schick. I was born in Vienna in 1921. I come from a family that's a little bit unique because my parents lived in the United States for 11 or 12 years, right at the turn of the century. They came over in 1899 and lived in Pittsburgh. My brother was born in New York in 1911. My mother went to see her folks in Vienna on a vacation, and the war broke out. My father had come over to try to rescue her, but it didn't work. First World War intervened, and he was immediately drafted into the Hungarian army. He was an officer. When he came back in 1918, he still would have liked to go back to the United States, which was his first love, but he was not in good health because he had frozen legs that was a war injury, and they decided to stay in Europe. I was born in 1921. I was sort of a late addition. Maybe I wasn't even planned at that time. And we settled down to a sort of a lower middle class life in Vienna. Money was not plentiful. My mother ran a retail store, and she could barely make a living, especially during the Depression. And my father was still dreaming about the United States. My father could not come back, and that was a terrible problem for him. The only thing that he could do is dream about the United States. He taught me to speak English, taught my brother, who was 10 years older, to speak English. And we actually became Austrian citizens, all of us. My brother retained his American citizenship because he was a native of the United States and he had dual citizenship. But everybody else in the family was an Austrian. So we went through the usual educational processes in grade school and high school and a technical university, and had a lot of trouble making ends meet in 1932 and 1933. But there was always enough to eat. It was enough for me to have a bike, but we had to work pretty hard in that retail store because we couldn't afford any employees. In 1938, Austria was taken over. So as soon as Hitler marched in and threw the weak Austrian government out, the pogrom started. The Viennese were extremely good in taking the stores and the banks away from the Jewish people. And although the Kristallnacht was not until November 1938, even between March and November, the ownership of many Jewish assets in Vienna changed, and people were put on the street. In 1938, we lost our right to be educated in a college of higher education, and I had to go to a technical school that taught engineering as far as textiles are concerned. That was the only thing we could still do. And in 1939, they prohibited Jews from going to any school. Even little children could not go to school anymore. My brother was very active before 1938 on the socialist end of the political scale. In fact, he had been arrested once because he took pamphlets to Italy he was a social democrat or a socialist at that time, and his name was on practically every political list. So when the Nazis marched in, they took that list, and before they ever touched any other Jews, they imprisoned my brother in Buchenwald. He was only there for 6 weeks, because at that time somebody in our family had the great idea that he still had his American citizenship, which you never lose when you're born in this country. And I think my parents contacted the consul in Germany, because Buchenwald was, of course, in southern Germany, and the consul rescued several American citizens that had been imprisoned in these concentration camps, and my brother was actually let out and had to leave the country within a couple of days. He still got married quickly because he had a fiancée there. He wanted to get her to the United States, and he left for the United States. My mother and my father and I, who was relatively young, were left, and we muddled through. We had an apartment, but then we had to move into one room. Nobody really did much of anything at that time.
Had your mother lost her store by that time?
Yeah, my mother had lost her store. She was trying to sell her store before the Nazis took over, and she sold the store to people that we thought would be nice enough to meet the obligations as far as money is concerned. But they made one payment, and that was the end of it. And she lost her store. My father died in 1941, early 1941. At that time, I had been drafted into a forced labor group, which the Nazis called commandos. The Gestapo and the SS and the SA shipped many Jewish families out almost immediately in 1939 and 1940. And the group that I was forced to join had to take the furniture and the personal belongings out of apartments that the people had to be removed and shipped out from. So we had to unlock apartments that had been locked before. There was nobody in these apartments. In some cases, the food was still on the table, and the suitcases were strewn around the room. People had been surprised overnight and taken to these collection centers, and they were gone. We had to remove the furniture, sometimes from apartment houses on the 4th or 5th floor, drag it down, and the Nazis put all that furniture, labeled it in the good German fashion. They kept a real good track of it, labeled it, and put it into huge warehouses. The valuables that they found, in some cases, gold coins and jewelry and so forth, they were taken by the SS men who were in charge of this commando group. It was very hard work, but we did get enough to eat. And one of the things that was an advantage, of course, was that the people that worked for this commando, for this work detail, were protected from. They were not shipped out. That means you could pretty well figure that you had a few months' grace. Nobody came to pick you up. So consequently, my mother was protected too. After my father died, I could move in with my mother, and any time one of these commandos came to pick the people up, I had a identification card, and I could show it, and they didn't pick me up. When the commander group was down to 200 people, we were the last ones in Vienna. We were sort of turning out the light, And every week they would post a list of people that would still be retained. If your name was not on that list, you knew it was just a question of days when they would come and pick you up. In the meantime, my mother had been able to get a visa to come back to the United States. My brother was able to send her that visa because she was a direct descendant of an American citizen, and the law permitted a preferential quota number. So mother, who, as I said, had lived here for 12 or 13 years before, was able to come back to this country and join my brother. She really didn't want to go at that time because she felt she was going to leave me in Europe, but after many discussions, I convinced her that she couldn't help me anyway at that point. I was 18 or 19 years old, and what could mother do to protect me from the Nazis? So we finally convinced her, my brother by mail and me in person, that she should actually go. And she was on one of the last trains that was a SEAL train that the Germans let go through France. Of course, the war hadn't started yet. She got on a ship that sailed from Portugal to New York. My brother was already in Kansas City, and mother joined him in Kansas City then. But I was left in Austria. And I knew that my hours were to be counted on one hand, so I decided not to stay and make one effort to escape. In order to do that, I had to move out of the room that I lived in. I found somebody who, for money, promised to take me across the Hungarian border. And in order to do that, he had to wait for favorable conditions on the border. I think it was probably raining or snowing. Somebody picked me up, took me by train to the Hungarian border. We got off that train because at the last terminal at that train, there were SS and Gestapo people waiting because lots of people had tried to cross the border. But we jumped off that moving train and ran across the fields. We did hear the dogs that the German border police had, but we got into Hungary. My problem was that I didn't speak any Hungarian, so I had to, every time I came into a public place in Hungary, I had to fake that I was deaf and dumb and couldn't speak. We boarded a train in Hungary, went to Budapest. Budapest at that time was not in the war. It was a completely different atmosphere than Vienna. People were still shopping windows, and streets were lit and so forth. So it was quite an experience for me to get to Budapest at that time. One of the things the Hungarian government had to promise, that if there were any refugees or immigrants coming from Austria, from Germany into Hungary, that the Hungarians would grab them and intern them. And they did that, and the Hungarian police was constantly on the lookout for illegal refugees from Austria or Germany. So when we got to Budapest, I had some relatives there, and my uncle was an attorney, and I had his address, and this guide that took me across the border actually took me to his apartment, which was in one of the fashionable parts of Budapest. When I walked in, he knew who I was, but he immediately told me that he couldn't put me up because it meant that they themselves would be interned too if they helped an illegal refugee. So he did give me a meal and told me to leave, which I really can't blame him for because he was in mortal danger too. The man that had brought me across the border, who was a Gentile and did it strictly for money, somehow felt sorry for me and told me that I had to stay someplace. I think it was cold, it was raining or snowing, I don't know. But he only had one particular place in mind where I could go, so he took me by streetcar to one of the rundown districts of Budapest and put me up with a group of gypsies. Well, this didn't last very long. About 2 or 3 weeks into that, the Hungarian police came and raided the place. They put me into a camp in Budapest, in a school I think that they had locked up, and there were many Austrians that had crossed the border and had been apprehended by the Hungarians. We stayed there for several weeks, I think. And then they shipped us to an internment camp in the north of Hungary, which was very close to the Polish border, I remember. And we practically didn't do anything all day long except everybody was waiting what would happen. We were guarded by Hungarian police, and we knew that if the Germans marched into Hungary to take over Hungary at that time, it would only be a question of time when that would happen, that the people in these camps would immediately become German prisoners. So we decided, a group of us decided to try to escape. So we bribed the Hungarian guard, I think, and he looked the other way while we cut the barbed wire and ran into the forest. I think somebody was shooting at us, but they didn't hit us, and we were able to walk about 15 or 20 miles to a railroad station and took a train back to Budapest. But there was no way to live there either because we didn't have any papers. People were looking for us. So I decided to try another related family. They had a farm in southern Hungary, a large farm, I would almost say an estate. So I was able to get a train to Kaposvár, which is fairly close to the Yugoslavian border on the south side of Hungary. When I walked in there, they actually told me that I could stay. The only problem was that they knew that the German troops were just a few days away at that time. So stayed there, did some farm work for 6 weeks, 2 months maybe. And one morning we woke up and the Germans had crossed the border. There were the first tanks, the German tanks coming in, but there was no resistance anyway. So my relatives again told me that they couldn't keep me because if I would be found there, they would be in turn. So they told me to leave. I took whatever stuff I had, which was very little, into a bag, and I went south to the Yugoslav border. Yugoslav border is a river. It's called the Drava. So we jumped with all of our belongings on our back. We jumped into the river and tried to swim across, but there had been a flood, and the river was so fast that we could never get across. We would jump into the river, and the river would carry us down 5-6 miles. We would get out, and we could never get across because the Drava was running too high at that point. So we finally had to give up. We were exhausted and made our way back into Hungary. But the way we looked and the way we acted, we were dog-tired. Some policemen saw us and handcuffed us and turned us over to the Germans. The Germans had a big collection camp there in southern Hungary where they took all the Austrians and the Germans and the undesirable Hungarian Jews, and they put them into that internment camp, which was huge, and that was just a way station for Auschwitz. And 3 days later, the freight train pulled up. We were herded into the freight cars. The doors were sealed. I would say there were about 80 people or 70 people in each one of these cars, old and young, mostly Germans, mostly Austrian Jews, and a few Hungarian Jews that were apprehended by the Germans too. And a new chapter began for me because I never had seen that before. So the train pulled out after the doors were sealed, and we didn't get anything to eat, and we didn't get anything to drink for many, many days. They had German guards sitting on top of each one of these cars with submachine guns. And after a day or two, the conditions in that railroad car were absolutely unspeakable. I mean, maybe they were not that bad compared to what I saw later, but it was bad because it was the first time that I had been a prisoner of the Germans. So we never got any water, we never got any food. We tried to cut some holes into the floor of that railroad car, and we were able to. Somebody had some tools, and we were trying to let ourselves through these holes between the rails and maybe lay there until the train pulled away and possibly escape. But that didn't go very far because somebody had tried that from a car behind us, and the Germans had gotten wise to it, and they were just shooting the people right there while they were trying to lay there. So we decided not to get out. But we did have holes cut into the walls, and the train moved through a beautiful region of Slovakia, the Tatra Mountains, which that looked like paradise, having been imprisoned there, and the train moved through this gorgeous alpine scenery. Maybe we thought that was the last thing we would still see, and but there was no way to escape. It just the Germans were in such a vantage point, sitting on top of these cars, that anybody who could get out of these cars and run across the field would be picked off one by one anyway. So I remember that the weather got very cold, and a lot of elderly people froze to death in these cars. And I think we were on the way for at least 4 days. That's not that big a distance, but the train would stop and it would go, and it would stop and it would go. I cannot remember that they ever opened any of these cars to even give people water. By the time the train stopped in Birkenau, which of course is Auschwitz, they opened the door. It was early in the morning. I think 2/3 of the people in this car were dead. When they finally opened the door to the railroad car, we were sitting on the railroad siding in Birkenau. About 30 feet from us, there was this electrical barbed wire, and we saw the first prisoners in striped uniforms behind it. We still had our civilian clothes at that time. So it was a new experience. We didn't have much time to contemplate that. The weather was terrible. It was raining. The German guards, the first time we saw SS in action at time, they beat us out of these cars, and we were lined up. We did have a lot of women and children on that train, and they, of course, went to the gas chamber immediately. And the people that looked like they could still work and survive ran on the right side, they took us in a marching column into the camp in Birkenau. There were mostly younger men at that point, and when we got in, we saw a different world. The chimneys were smoking. You could see the fire, and we knew what was burning in this crematory. And they put us into the camp. Now they shaved the head off and they stamped numbers on it. That was done by prisoners. There was no room in the regular barracks in Birkenau at that time. So our group of people, maybe 200 men that had come off that train, were put in a barracks that was reserved for non-Jewish German and Polish and Hungarian criminals. And not only were we victims of the Nazi guards, these criminals started to torture us. While we had a work detail outside, and we marched out of Birkenau every day to build a road which led to no place. We also, when we got back into the camp, we had to perform punishment labor. That was directed by the functionaries or capos of the people in this barracks who were either Polish or German criminals. So when we got back, we had to take blocks of cement and jog around the camp on a prescribed route with this thing on the back, on our backs. And then after we performed that for about an hour, then we could come inside and get whatever lousy food they had. Then in the morning we marched out with the Germans again and built the road. When you march out of Birkenau into a work detail, the first thing that hits you, of course, at the gate was this large orchestra playing classical music. That's what the Germans, they loved that. And there must have been 80 or 90 musicians sitting there playing classical music while the prisoners marched out with the German shepherd dogs and the SS guards with drawn pistols behind them. And then the next stop were the gallows, where they had where the corpses were swaying. Those were people that had tried to escape, and they caught them and brought them back and strung them up, and they were dead, and they left them up there for many, many days sometimes. So there was a reminder that escape from Auschwitz leads to the gallows. We were workers, which was a laugh, because when we went into a work detail, we had built a road through the swamps that surround Auschwitz. And we had to sod the embankments of that road. And although these were all relatively healthy men at that point, it was almost impossible to pick up one of these sod bricks because it must have weighed about 80 or 90 pounds, and they loaded that on your back, and you had to jog. You could never walk from where they cut that sod out and put it on the embankment of the road. And many people were shot, many people were beaten unmercifully, and many, many prisoners were chewed to pieces these vicious dogs. After so long, the commander of the work group was decimated severely, so they had to get some prisoners from someplace else. And the SS guards had a great time making prisoners run across a field and shooting them in the back. When they moved us from the regular criminal barracks into the regular Jewish barracks, I remember that they were looking for people who would join what they called the Sonderkommando. That was the group of prisoners that had to assist in the crematoria. The Germans used Sonderkommandos for 4 weeks, and then the people were killed and they were getting another group for Sonderkommandos. So the best thing that I could do is sort of disappear into the woodwork whenever there were volunteers or whenever some group was chosen. I tried to be as far away as I possibly could. I remember that I spent a whole night outside once because I didn't want to be picked. Just about that time, they picked the healthier prisoners to go on a freight train into Germany, away from the Russians. And I was picked for one of these escape trains. Where they took us was Oranienburg, Sachsenhausen, which was next to an aircraft factory. That particular factory was bombed to smithereens anyway by the time we were there. So back into one of these cattle cars again, and deeper into Germany. We didn't know where we were going. We had no idea. We landed, the train stopped in a work camp. The name of the camp was Kaufering. In Kaufering, the barracks were pretty well deteriorated. The food was unbelievably bad. We got a few ounces of thin broth and a piece of bread in the evening, black coffee in the morning. I can't remember that we got anything at noon, but that's what we existed on. And we worked. They took us inside this mountain, and we were digging new tunnels that they could use for factory space. I remember one morning when I was getting to the end of my strength, they lined everybody up in the morning to go out on these work details. And as long as you could go out on those work details, you're relatively safe. You would get the food. People that couldn't make these work details anymore would be taken out and shot. And all of the people around me marched out singing. The Germans were great in having prisoners sing. And I was the only person on that huge square, and I couldn't move anymore. I was lying on the ground. I thought that was the end of me because I knew that anybody who had not gone out on that work detail would be killed that same day. How I crawled away from there and hid in a barracks, I'm not sure. Anyway, they had some kind of a hospital there that they would take some prisoners to, and somebody was kind to drag me to that hospital. There was a Viennese doctor there that I actually had known in Vienna, and he said, well, the problem with you is that not only are you getting very weak, you have rampant tuberculosis, and I can't do anything for you. I have no medicine, and the best you can do is just try to disappear into the woodwork. Don't show your face. So I could no longer go out. Well, I got weaker and weaker. And in the meantime, they decided that they couldn't keep Kaufering going. The underground factory was practically shut down, so they decided to take whatever was left in Kaufering and load them on railroad cars and take them to Dachau. Well, the train that they took us on between Kaufering and Dachau must have been noticed by Allied aircraft. And some of the fighter planes, the American fighter planes, came over. They thought it was a troop train, and they picked off with a machine gun all the SS guards that were sitting on top. And then they bombed the cars, the railroad cars. So one of the American bombs fell on our car and split it wide open. The car burned. We all fell out of the car. The train stopped because they had hit the engine too. And lo and behold, that was the first time we were free, but we were in Germany at that time. We were in striped uniforms. We looked like skeletons. And the Germans had done a good job in marking us at that point because we didn't look like humans anymore. So we dragged ourselves into the forest. And we came to a farmhouse there. And we thought, we didn't think of freedom at all. All we wanted is food, maybe milk. The farmers, the German farmers, took one look at us and screamed. Children were running away from us. They'd never seen human beings the way we looked. And instead of giving us food, they turned us over to the police. SS came in trucks and finally trucked us into Dachau. There were rumors in the camp that the French and the American troops were heading for Dachau. They weren't looking for Dachau, but they were coming up that particular road. But it took a long, long time until we really heard gunshots. And then the Americans came. And they knew what to do. They went through the barracks and removed all the bodies. And I would say that 50% of all the bodies in the barracks were dead anyway. Then whenever they saw life, they would load them on a truck and cart them to an American field hospital. There were doctors waiting, there were nurses waiting. And I was one of them, although I showed very little sign of life. Somebody must have decided that I wasn't dead yet. Because when I woke up, I was in an American field hospital. There was a nurse from Cleveland that took care of me. I could not eat. There was no way. I could not tolerate any food. So they gave me IV. My digestive system was completely destroyed. There was no way for me to eat. And I got massive dosage of, I don't know whether it was penicillin or sulfur. Maybe at that time it was still sulfur 50 years ago. And slowly but surely they actually got me back into some kind of state of life. Although I could not get out of bed, I was much too weak. But I was lucky I didn't die. And this is when somebody from the United States came with a typewriter, and I wrote everything I remembered at that time. My biggest problem was I had almost complete amnesia. I could not remember. I could remember where I was from. I could remember that I had the remnants of a family living in the United States, but I could not remember where they were living. Kansas City didn't mean anything to me at that time. So they were trying to contact relatives, but there was no way because I I thought maybe they were still living in New York, and I could not remember. Well, when I got to the point where I could walk, they asked for people, survivors, that spoke English. And I remembered that I spoke English. My father had taught me. And they wanted some survivors to act as guides in Dachau to show Allied troops that came into Dachau what a concentration camp or death camp was like. So, although I had spent my captured life in Auschwitz and in Kaufering, I didn't know much about Dachau, but I guess all crematoria are about the same. So we started to take Allied soldiers that wanted to see what it was like through the camps. We showed them the ovens, showed them the bodies, we showed them the effects that they had taken away from people, like rings and gold teeth. Having a job as a civilian employee, we wore uniforms but no insignia, and we got military rations, and we lived in German houses that had been evacuated by the Germans. And we got all the food we wanted. One day, when I was taking some officers through the camp, one of the officers, captain, looked at the name tag I had. We had military name tags, and I had my name on here. And he looked at it, and he said, "This is strange. I can't believe it. But are you related to a sergeant in my intelligence troop by the name of Schick?" So I said, "What's his first name?" "His name is Herbert, and he lost a brother in Auschwitz." And I said, "He didn't lose a brother in Auschwitz. This is my brother, and now I remember." And this captain didn't look at the camp anymore, jumped into his Jeep and drove all night. And my brother jumped into the same Jeep and came back to Dachau. And that's how we met. Herbert then took me out of Dachau. I then lived with my brother's battalion, but my brother was sent back to the States, and I stayed in Germany until I got to the point where I felt it was safe enough to go back to Vienna. So I went back to Vienna. I was reunited with Eve, who had waited all through the war, and we decided we still loved each other enough, and I asked her whether she would like to come to the States with me, because I knew that eventually I would land over here. She said yes. So we came in 1946, in July. Both of us wanted to draw a line under everything that had happened before and start a new life. And we were able to do that.